Well, we'll start with what your name is.
Larry Woods, and gathered here with us are you, my grandson Miles Woods, my beautiful smart wife Sarah Lee Woods, and this stranger here that we picked up on the way, attorney Hal Hardin.
We're going to start with how and why you became an attorney.
I grew up in Donaldson, a suburb of Nashville. My mom buried two husbands before she was 40 years old. So when my dad, her second husband, died in 1953, my mom had to raise three boys. I realized that when I went to college and applied for scholarships, which is the only way my brother's ever going to get there, she had to file a financial statement. And I didn't understand the significance of then as a kid. I look back now and think, wow, my mother was the hardest working, smartest woman I ever knew. She raised us making $2,900 a year, working 6 days a week, no days off, no paid vacation all her life. I don't remember her ever buying a dress. She did buy shoes every 3 or 4 years because she was on her feet all day, 6 days a week. She had it really rough. She was valedictorian of her high school, but as with most women who were born in the early part of the 1900s, no real opportunities. She went to work for a doctor, Dr. Robert Gaston in Dawson. It was always good to her. But we had really rough financial times growing up. We didn't starve, but there was not a penny to be had in the household. My brother Frank went to work at a regular job, 20 hours a week when he was in 7th grade. I did him one better and went to work at the same place in 6th grade. And we've worked all our life. I've worked 2 full-time jobs my adult life, one of which is being a lawyer, the others being constitutional law professor at Tennessee State University. I became a lawyer because I wanted to engineer social justice. I wanted to make ours a more egalitarian, equal opportunity society so that everyone could benefit. And I remember it crystal clear. I was on the debate team, and we were at the Vanderbilt debate tournament. I was debating for Emory University, and our debate coach went to a banquet in the middle of the tournament. And I'm walking back to the next round, and he catches up with him and says, "You should have heard this speech at the banquet." I said, "Oh." And he said, "Yeah, an English professor at Vanderbilt just sold President Lyndon Johnson down the road, accused me of everything but being a communist, blasted his OEO war on poverty proposals and his civil rights proposals, just never done a good thing," according to this professor. And I said, "Oh, that sounds horrible." And he said, "Yeah," he said, "poor people ought to starve because they ought to be out working rather than being poor." And I just laughed out loud at the ignorance and thought, surely people around here are better than that. And my debate coach then said he was especially critical of the legal aid programs President Johnson is proposing to create with federal funding. And I said, "What's that?" "Provide lawyers for poor people." And I thought to myself, when my debate coach said that, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And sure enough, I went to Northwestern Law School after graduating at Emory and interviewed all over the country. Shouldn't have bothered because I wanted to go back to Atlanta where I'd been in college. And I interviewed with Maynard Jackson, a famous Georgia politician, later mayor of Atlanta, about the Emory legal aid program, and interviewed with the Atlanta legal aid program. And they both offered me a job. And being interested in politics, I took the job offer with Maynard Jackson. And they said, not Maynard, but somebody worked for him, Fred Leclerc, later a UT law professor for decades, said, "I'll take care of signing up for the Georgia bar. I'll take care of all the paperwork. Don't worry about it." Well, he didn't do it. He dropped the ball. I graduated Northwestern. I wasn't eligible to take the Georgia bar because I hadn't signed up. I've turned down all the other job offers I got. I'm feeling pretty low at that point. I called Atlanta Legal Aid back and talked to Michael Terry, whom I'd interviewed with, said, "Mr. Terry, look, I'm sorry, I turned you down your job offer. I should have taken it. Any chance you might have an opening?" He said, "Absolutely. Show up August 1. So it all worked out. I practiced law 2 years in Atlanta and then came back to Nashville because of politics and wound up staying here and practicing politics and practicing law.
Well, next, can you tell us about your work on the death penalty cases?
Well, death penalty is all about politics and all about law. Hal Hardin here and I have been deeply involved together, both in the pardon and parole events of the Governor Ray Blanton administration in the late 1970s, which affected me in terms of people I was representing on death row at the time. Then Hal and I won the Gross Close X. Rel. Harris versus Dutton case in federal court that shut the death row down in Tennessee for 18 years. So it's not just law, it's also politics. So let's start with, I guess, Governor Ray Blanton. Governor Blanton was a U.S. Congressman from West Tennessee. He ran for the U.S. Senate in 1972, losing to Howard Baker, the Republican. And Blanton used that statewide name recognition he created to then win the governorship in 1974. Hal and I were very active in that election, along with a lot of our friends, because we had formed a group we called it the Tennessee Committee. Some people called it the Committee of 100. Basically, that committee grew out of the Ross Bass campaign of 1964 and the John J. Hooker campaign in 1966. My brother Frank Woods essentially ran the Ross Bass campaign in 64, and in a major upset, Bass beat Governor Frank Clement in the Democrat primary. 2 reasons Bass won. The first one, and the real reason, was he campaigned on, I will vote for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. One of the few politicians in the Southern United States willing to take that stance publicly. It got him elected in 1964. Second reason Bass won was he kept pestering Frank, I need a better speech to give at all the county courthouse on the square that I'm going from county to county on. So Frank had me help him write a speech for Bass on, I'm against disease. And it worked. He gave that same speech in every county for 3 months, and people voted for it. That and the civil rights support.
Well, but a lot of people say that that you two, especially, cheered him into the office. You all went out there and were constantly bringing his name up and working, and you all are given a lot of credit, you and your brother, for winning that election.
Well, thank you, Hal. It was one of those elections we really enjoyed. We were supporting a guy who believed in the right things, and it was fun. And winning, of course, was the most fun of all. Hal and I and Frank all knew each other because all 3 of us were working our way through college by going hitchhiking out to the West Coast, Walla Walla, Washington, and Kent, Washington, and working in the green pea and green bean harvest and canning them, and worked for Libby, McNeil and Libby mostly. And we met across a poker table in a poker game one night. We all recognized each other's accent.
That's exactly right.
Hal grew up in DuPont, I grew up in Donaldson, etc. Frank was sort of the ringleader. And when Frank and I and others successfully won that Ross Bass campaign, we then started getting ready for the John J. Hooker for governor election. I think you transferred, didn't you, from UT to Vanderbilt to be more involved in the campaign?
Got me into Vanderbilt.
That's right. Offered to get me into Vanderbilt Law School, and by then I was saying no. So we all worked in the Hooker campaign in '66 when Hooker lost the Democrat primary to Buford Ellington, and pretty immediately started planning to run for the same thing in 1970. And the people we recruited for the Hooker campaign, the young people for the Hooker campaign, were people our age who were lawyers and architects. Isn't that what Rudy was in Memphis?
I think he was.
And we were looking to be involved, wanted to be involved in politics. We wanted to make this a better place. We had 3 political parties in Tennessee those days, and most of my life. We had Republicans from East Tennessee who were Lincoln Republicans. They didn't want us to secede from the Union. We also had very conservative Republicans in Shelby County area. And then we had two different Democratic parties, really. We had the conservative Democrats who had controlled the governorship for a century. And we had liberal Democrats like myself and Hal and Frank and others who, except for Senator Gore Sr. and Senator Estes Kefauver, who had never won an election in Tennessee. And Gore and Kefauver only started winning about 1950. So for most voters in Tennessee, it was a choice every year between the East Tennessee Republicans and the conservative Democrats, and the conservative Democrats always won, usually. Then Bass changes that by beating Frank Clement, who's the most liberal governor in my lifetime in Tennessee, but was the leader of the conservative Democratic Party. Don't ask me to explain that. Hal and I talk a lot about this in a video we did about a year ago for the Tennessee Women's Collaborative. And we're going to try to attach that video to the end of this one to give you more detail on a lot of that. But out of all those campaigns we worked together on in the 60s, right after the 1970 election that Hooker lost to Winfield Dunn, Frank and Hal and I and Charles Burson and Rudy from Memphis and Pete Irons and a couple of district attorneys from around the state, Charlie Susano and George Thompson and about 20 others got together and decided we were going to form our own political party. Except we weren't going to call it that. We didn't have the chutzpah to call it that. We're going to form the Tennessee Committee. And the idea was we'll take control of the state Democratic Party structure and try to make sure they nominate good people and reform their efforts so we can start winning more elections. So we met, as I recall, half a dozen times over the next couple of years, plotting strategy, bringing more people in. We met once at Fall Creek Falls. We met at another state park. Met out Frank's house once near the governor's mansion. Frank had good locating there, a couple of doors down. And we would strategize. How can we bring people like us who believe in equal rights, who believe in trying to do good things for people, who believe in trying to help poor people and people that are oppressed? How can we get more people like us elected and into leadership positions? And we did a good job of it. We got a great U.S. attorney, Hal Hardin, when Jimmy Carter came into office. We got some great judges appointed. We were very successful behind the scenes. We amassed enough power just by trying, not by money, not by how we were born or who we knew, just by organizing and trying. We amassed enough power that the state Democratic Party structure said to us, tell you what, we'll let you, the Tennessee Committee, pick the new executive director of the Tennessee Party, which we did. Rudy, I can't remember his last name, from Memphis, became the new executive director of the state party. We picked 2 or 3 directors in a row there and worked hard to help Jim Sasser beat Bill Brock for the U.S. Senate in 1976. Worked hard to help Jimmy Carter carry the state in the presidential election. I think our downfall, when we're going to start losing influence and sort of becoming irrelevant, was probably the 1974 governor's election. 10 serious candidates, can you believe that? 10 serious candidates ran for the Democratic nomination for governor in 1974. Ray Blanton came in first. Jake Butcher came in second. Tommy Wiseman came in third. Stan Snodgrass maybe was fourth, either that or Franklin Haney. 10 candidates. No runoff requirement, no majority requirement. Blanton wins the nomination with 22% of the vote. I still believe to this day Tommy Wiseman would have won that election, except the Tennessean did a hatchet job on him the week before the election. They ran 2 or 3 front page stories saying Wiseman cannot win. You know, they didn't say we don't like Wiseman. They didn't say we don't like his positions and policies. In fact, they were pretty squarely Tennessean positions and policies. just front page stories saying all you voters out there thinking about who you're going to vote for, Wiseman can't win. I mean, it was a brutal hatchet job.
But as Wiseman said, he finished first among the non-felons.
Right. Yes, Tom was good at that. He was first among the non-felons.
Go back to the
Butcher and Blanton.
Go back to the Tennessee committee, though. I mean, it was decided originally that we had to get rid of the executive director of the Democratic Party. And to get rid of him, we had to operate in secret and figure out how we're going to do it and get all of our people there en masse. And we did that. And everyone was shocked. I remember the executive director was really shocked, and all of his allies.
I'd forgotten the meeting. Yes.
But then the funny thing was that all of a sudden, well, who is going to take his place? And they said, well, Frank Woods, why don't you take it? Well, I can't take it. Well, Larry Woods, why don't you take it? Well, Hal Hardin, what I can't take it. We were like a dog that had caught the car. We caught it and we didn't know what to do with it. So you mentioned Rudy. You don't even remember Rudy's last name, and I don't either. And the headlines in the paper was, "Who is Rudy?"
Right.
I mean, Rudy is the new executive director of the Democratic Party, and nobody knows who he is.
I had forgotten the part. We didn't know what to do when we won. Bad planning on our part. But Rudy did a good job. I don't mean that. But we couldn't salvage the party. We were so split after the 1974 primary, where there was no one leader of the party anymore, even though Blanton's going to beat Lamar Alexander for governor soundly. It was like 56% to 44%, Blanton over Alexander. But Blanton's going to create so many problems for himself. Blanton's going to preside over or create or be involved in so many scandals. I think of all the scandals, I think my read would be Blanton was probably involved in about half of them. The other half, the media probably blamed him for, but it was more a question of he just wasn't paying attention on the other half. The biggest scandal, the two biggest scandals were who got liquor licenses. This was a day and age where you had to have a liquor license to sell liquor. If you were one of the store owners that had a liquor license, that was a printing press to make money. You were going to be an instant millionaire. So the pressure and the political heat was really on Blanton about who he was going to award or have the ABC award the liquor licenses to. And I don't think that's what he was convicted of. He was convicted of income tax fraud, is my memory.
Related to a liquor license.
But it was related to a liquor license. The other, and we could stop and tell the story of the Kingsport lawyer, maybe a lawyer who represented Blanton. Blanton's later going to file a habeas corpus saying that lawyer who represented me wasn't a lawyer and never had a law license. You can look it up in the Sixth Circuit opinion. It's a very interesting story. And I'm not sure anybody ever really resolved who was correct factually. And like the court does so often on lawyer competency questions, the court rendered a terrible decision saying, doesn't really matter whether the Kingsport guy was a lawyer or not. He did an okay job. And I'm thinking, no, Gideon versus Wainwright says you get a lawyer, not somebody acting like a lawyer, but different story for a different day. The other major scandal, even bigger scandal in the Blanton administration was, I remember picking up the newspaper one day, and there was a story somewhere in the paper about the governor's lawyer, Eddie Sisk, is being investigated about pardon and parole matters. It wasn't real clear what was going on or what the investigation was. You know, one of those opaque type stories. But then after that, there were TV, radio, newspaper stories for a year and a half about the governor's lawyer and others in the administration may have been selling pardons and paroles to families of inmates at the state prison. They called it cash for clemency. And then it all kind of died down. I don't know whether the FBI investigation hit roadblocks or the evidence just wasn't there. There are 2 or 3 books on this. Started with Marie by Peter Moss, which I think is very inaccurate, but it's a very interesting book. Yeah. See, Hal was the U.S. attorney. He and I'm a defense attorney. We both think it was inaccurate. Then Hank Hillen, the FBI agent, wrote a book, and you can easily read about the Tennessee pardon and parole scandal. There's several different versions. And let me say that right in the middle of all this, I've got a petition for pardon or parole pending for a client that I'd been representing pro bono without any payment or anything, because he was a friend of a friend kind of thing for 2 or 3 years. I appealed his conviction to the Sixth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals on habeas and lost. And then the friend said, what can I do now? So the only thing you do now is try to apply for a pardon. So we did it the right way. I said, go find his minister, have the minister write a letter, have the minister tell you 20 other people in the church or the community that'll support the application, have them write a letter, build a file about why this guy in state prison would have a stable life and be crime-free if you were granted a pardon. I mean, that is the traditional kind of grounds you apply for a pardon on. We put together a package. I don't know, it was good 8 inches thick. And I went down one day to Eddie Sisk's office. He wasn't there, and filed it with somebody. I've got an application for pardon and parole here. I'm saying this is where you filed it. That's right. And handed it over to them. And they stamped a cover letter for me. And I took it back to my office. Full disclosure, Eddie Sisk had been one of my law partners for a year and a half or so before Blanton won the governor's election. He then went to Governor Blanton's office to be his lawyer. Further full disclosure, my primary law partner, I'll talk a lot about today, Jane Ann Woods, my sister-in-law, also left the law firm partnership to become Commissioner of Revenue in Blanton's cabinet. Department of Revenue had absolutely nothing to do with any of this, but everything's in Sisk's office that's going on. Well, I filed this application for pardon and parole before there was any talk or publicity about any kind of scandal or wrongdoing. And I kept waiting to get a hearing or ruling or action, and nothing happened, and I waited a couple of months, and I called down there and said, I just want to check, am I supposed to be filing anything else? I filed an application. Do I need to do anything else at this point? No, we'll get back to you. Don't you call us, we'll call you, blah, blah, blah. So I waited another 2 or 3 months, no action. And I call again, get the runaround. So I hang up, and I sit there and I think, okay, I need to call Sisk. He's the guy in charge of all this. I've been talking to whoever these people are that work for him. I just need to call him. So I call Eddie's phone number, get his voicemail. Eddie, this is Larry Woods back at the law firm. I filed an application for pardon and parole for this particular client 6 months ago. Haven't heard anything. What do I need to do to get a hearing or a ruling on this? I'd like to have a hearing where I can argue it, but what do I need to do? In response to that, the next day, a female voice calls me that I don't know or recognize, saying, you left a message from Ms. Sisk yesterday about the application of so-and-so for a pardon and parole, and I'm returning that call. I said, oh, great. And who are you? My name is Marie Rajani, which how anybody familiar with this recognizes. She's one of the chief people handling pardon and parole in Sisk's office, and she's going to avoid criminal liability by becoming the chief source for the FBI for the investigations coming on, or it certainly appears to me from reading the books and the newspapers, she was the chief source of information for them, which I understand that. I represent a lot of people who, when they got trouble, figured out I can get out of trouble by becoming the chief source for the prosecutors. I don't know what her situation was, never met the woman. Only had one conversation with her in my life, this telephone call, and it was one heck of a strange conversation. She kept saying things that came this close to making me think there was some kind of bribe going on. I kept looking at the phone thinking, okay, I'm not hearing her right. She never said anything criminal. She never said anything that I could quote to a judge and say, look how improper this is. She was very careful. So I don't know whether she was sitting there with other people and they were all in on this, or this is on her own. Maybe I misunderstood this whole conversation. Keep in mind, this is before the scandals are public knowledge. This is, I'm just making a routine call about, I got a guy that wants clemency. What do I need to do to get him a hearing? And she's talking about, well, who do you know? And how well off is his family? And I'm looking at the phone like, what's this got to do with anything? And finally, the conversation just ends. I mean, she's talking about Mars and I'm talking about Venus, and we're not communicating. And I hang the phone up and walk down the hall to my law partner, Jim Bryan's office, say, Jim, let me tell you about a conversation I just had and get your reaction to it. Yeah, and then I called in a couple of the other lawyers, and we all sort of had the same reaction, decided, let's not call her and talk to her again. Let's just write a letter to Sis and say, hey, we need a hearing of this. I wrote a letter, never heard a word. Throughout the next 2 or 3 years of all this, never heard a word. My client never got clemency, never got a hearing. Obviously, I didn't say or do the right things as defined by the clemency and pardon parole office at that time. Then the investigation obviously starts up again, the FBI investigation, or at least as far as the media is concerned, it starts up again. It's probably going on the whole time. And they put in some body wires, I guess, and got some recordings. And they sent somebody of some marked currency. And they arrested Eddie Sis getting off getting off an airplane at the airport from Memphis, where he'd flown down there and met with somebody that paid him with marked currency in return for pardon or parole. It wasn't just Eddie, there were 2 or 3 others heavily involved at that point. They all get arrested.
The governor's bodyguard.
Yes, I've forgotten that. Mixed in with all this also is the state photographer who's a convicted murderer, murdered his wife and her lover when he caught them in bed together. And when he's convicted and sentenced to life or thereabouts in state prison, I think he served a couple of weeks, and Governor Blanton gets a call from his father, who's a strong Blanton supporter. And in response, the governor says, release that guy, work release, send him up to state cap. We're going to make him the state photographer for the next 4 years. And I mean, it's just scandal after scandal after scandal. Eddie and his crew get arrested at that point. Yeah, everything's unclear. Hal's bound to know a whole lot more here, which I'm sure he can't talk about. He was the U.S. attorney, the chief federal prosecutor. He's the guy, over the FBI and all of this. Had you moved out of office when Sisk actually went to trial?
No.
Okay, you were still there.
Yeah.
And therefore, he's under a lot of restrictions about what he can talk about and what he can't. I didn't actually represent anybody in this. Eddie asked me to represent him at one point. One of the others asked me to represent him at one point. And I just said, no, I don't need to be involved in this case. They've gotten good lawyers, and I'm just going to stay out of it. That gets us to 3 years later on pardon and parole. Not 3 years later, gets us to 1978. I left out anything before we get to Lamar and the swearing in?
Well, there's a lot, but you could go on forever.
Yes, we can talk
There's
for
a lot of stuff.
Call me if you want to know more. I'll get with Hal and we'll buy you a cup of coffee.
Read the book, The Coup.
Well, let me say this more. I started part of this by saying all this is politics when you're practicing law, and it is. I had represented Governor Blanton when he took office in January of 1975. A month later, 3 weeks later, he flew down to Western State Hospital and walked into the director's office and said, Dr. Nenow, you're fired. Get out of here. Dr. Nenow hired a Republican lawyer named Fred Thompson that we all know to represent him, and he sued Governor Blanton for that. And Governor Blanton hired me to represent him in federal court in front of Judge L. Clore Morton. And, halfway through the trial, I'm saying to Shorty Freeland, the deputy governor, we didn't have that title in those days, but Mr. Freeland was deputy governor. Yeah, I'm up there meeting with him once a month to tell him about preparation for the trial, and then giving Shorty Freeland a report every day during the 2-week or so trial. And about halfway through it, I'm saying to Deputy Governor Freeland that things are not going well. They're beating us up on the due process issue of Nenow did not get any kind of hearing, and we're having a really rough time. Freeland was smart. Freeland said, okay, lawyer, that's why we hired you. What do we do? Don't just tell me what the law is. Don't just tell me we're probably going to lose. Tell me what we can do to change this situation. And I thought about it for an hour and called him back and said, this is easy. Schedule a hearing. He's complaining we violated due process 14th Amendment because he didn't get a hearing. Appoint a hearing officer. Let's have a hearing Saturday morning, 9 a.m. They can bring anybody they want to testify. We'll have the governor come and testify. He didn't want to come to court, but I thought, but this would be more private. News media won't be there, etc. Scheduled hearing. So we sent Fred Thompson, Dr. New now notice we're holding a hearing for you Saturday morning, 9 o'clock. They didn't show. They didn't show up for the hearing. So Monday morning, from Judge Boyle, I said, Judge, time to dismiss this lawsuit. They're suing us saying they didn't get a hearing. We gave them a hearing and they didn't show up. So Judge Morton dismisses it. We get in front of the Sixth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals 6 months or a year later. And it's one of those horror shows that every attorney loses sleep about. Fred Thompson starts because he's the appealing party. And about a minute into his argument, the lead judge says, well, attorney, that's fine. We've read your briefs, but they're all out of date. What I want to know is, in light of the Supreme Court's ruling in Elrod versus Burns, doesn't that change everything about this case in your appeal? You should have seen the look on Fred's face. He'd never heard of the case, had no clue what it was about. And I can remember from moot court, National Moot Court, the professor running at Northwest said to me, what are you going to do when they ask you a question you don't know anything about? And I fumbled around. He said, no. What you do is you say, Your Honor, I'm not familiar with that legal rule or that case. If you'll tell me what you're asking about, I'll give you the answer. Fred didn't do that. Fred tried to fake it like he knew what it was about. And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm so glad you're going first and not me. Through all the problems he had at that point, I figured out what it was about. It had been decided 2 days earlier by the Supreme Court. No email, no digital in those days. A case decided 2 days ago was an unknown case. So Fred and Dr. Nina got blistered on that. Let's talk about the death penalty, because that's the other half of the pardon and parole involvement for me. You were going to ask me about the death penalty, weren't you, Mr. Woods?
Yes, I was.
And this is going to be more politics again, this time Lamar Alexander and Ray Blanton. I'm representing a guy named William Grossclose, who was convicted in January 1978 of the murder, conspiracy murder of his then wife. And he and his co-defendant, Richard Austin, in February or March of 1978, are found guilty and sentenced to death. A minister here in town named Joe Engle, who spent his entire life ministering to people in prison, and especially those in death row, calls me up some point, I don't know, March, April, May, soon after Grossclose was convicted, and says, Larry, I'd like for you to take on a pro bono case for free and represent a guy convicted of murder in Memphis who's on death row. And as I should have said at the beginning, Jane Ann and I, when we started our law firm in 1971, we had no clients. Nobody had ever heard of us. Nobody knew we were lawyers. So we were constantly scrambling for 10 years, realistically, for clients and business and that kind of thing. So when Joe says, handle this death row case, I said to him, Joe, I did my first death row research and work for Senator Avon Williams in the 1960s when he put a note up on the Vanderbilt Law School bulletin board, some real chalk or board, not digital. Senator Williams put a note up on the Vanderbilt Law bulletin board saying he wanted help from an internal law clerk on a death penalty case. Anybody was interested, call him. So my brother Frank called me. Frank said, now, you know, I'm not interested in any of this stuff, Larry, but I know you are. Why don't you call Senator Williams? I said, fine, I'll call him. So I did research for Senator Williams on one of his death penalty cases, which he eventually won. So when Joe Engle, 10, 12 years later, calls me and says, you want to handle this death penalty case? I said, sure, I'll do it. Went out and met Mr. Grossclose, arranged to get all the paperwork in the files, wrote the Tennessee Supreme Court brief on his behalf. Lionel Barrett, who's done one of these interviews also, represented the co-defendant, Richard Austin. He and I argued our case in the Tennessee Supreme Court, and we lost. And we pretty well knew we were going to lose. The real issue in the case, we both knew reading the transcript, was incompetency of the lawyers involved. And that's going to be a 20-year struggle. It's going to be the late 1990s before I finally win the Grossclose case and the Austin case. And they then get a new trial in Memphis, etc. I believe are both convicted again, although neither is given the death penalty on the second go round. My point I want to make is Lionel and I and any lawyer involved in death penalty cases knew and understood nobody gets executed a year or 2 years or 3 years after the death penalty is imposed by a jury. These cases take, on average, 8-9 years to resolve on appeal. If they're really moving fast, maybe 5 years, 6 years on appeal. So when Lamar Alexander wins the 1978 governor's election and is going to get sworn in January of 1979, I was hoping Governor Blanton was going to pardon everybody on death row. Not just my guy. I think there were 7 people on death row at that point in 78. There weren't many. There were a handful of people on death row in Tennessee. Traditionally, every governor in my lifetime had pardoned everybody on death row and commuted their sentence to life imprisonment or something similar. And Winfield Dunn will quickly say, I didn't do that. The federal court made me do it. But in any event, every governor for 50, 75 years had pardoned everybody on death row. I'd had 2 or 3 conversations with my client saying, let's keep our fingers crossed that Blanton will pardon. Never discussed it with Governor Blanton, never filed anything with anybody. We were just, there was a newspaper editorial, in fact, about it 2 or 3 months earlier. Will the governor pardon people on death row, et cetera. Everybody pretty well expected to have, because Blanton had said, I think in public 2 or 3 times, yeah, I'm going to pardon people on death row. I'm going to pardon some honor trustees. I'm going to pardon this guy and this guy. And then he'd always say, and I'm going to pardon a lot of other people I'm going to pardon too, or something stupid like that. So I'm paying attention to, there's only a week or so left before Blanton's going to be out of office and Lamar is going to be in, because there's been no action announced from the governor's office about death row. And I'm like everybody, about 3 days before the scheduled swearing in, all of a sudden 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, there's a news break, breaking news kind of thing. We understand Governor-elect Lamar Alexander is being sworn into office as governor today, 3 days early. Well, that got my attention, of course. And so I got to TV or whatever, started watching it. And according to the news reports, which I think were pretty accurate that afternoon, information had come to the office of the United States Attorney, Mr. Hal Hardin sitting here, which led the Attorney General, Bill Leach, at the time, Louis Donald, well, I'm not sure Louis's name was in the news, but I knew he was involved. The U.S. Attorney, the Chief Federal Prosecutor, and the State Attorney General, who, is the Chief State Prosecutor and in charge of all the probable justice in the state, and a couple of other high-ranking officials, including the Speaker of the House,
the Lieutenant Governor, Speaker of the House, and eventually the Supreme Court Justice.
And I don't want to misstate anything you did that's not public, Hal. Hal and I had this running gun battle, but I want him to tell me more than's been public so far. Basically, the U.S. Attorney advised them, I've received word from an informant, a confidential source, that the governor is getting ready to pardon a lot of people. I'm not sure what, there wasn't a number, I don't think, just a bunch of people.
Well, specifically, there were 13 that we knew for a fact.
Okay, 13 people. And we
after he had just 2 nights before issued like 70 releases at midnight.
Right. So for people like me, defense lawyers hoping for a pardon for his client on death row, this is horrible news that Lamar hasn't been sworn in early to stop Blanton from issuing any more pardons. And of course, I'm reading the news thinking as a citizen, I understand most people said don't like Blanton's pardons and he's pardoning more people, but he's got the power to do that as governor. Unless he's getting paid for this, unless there's a crime associated with, there's no reason to stop him from pardoning people, no legal reason. But I feel confident that there was a clear indication that there was something illegal involved, whether it was payment of money, I don't know, don't think anybody knows, never really been hearing about that. So Alexander's sworn in. I talked to 2 or 3 lawyers the next day about, do you think they can do this? And there's some dispute about that. Even at the state attorney general's office, there's one deputy state attorney general who writes an opinion. I'm not sure it was an official opinion, but I've seen the memo, who wrote a memo saying, no, he can't be sworn in, or the state constitution says X and they've violated this section of it. And I don't know how strong an argument that is. I've never researched it really, but there's a lot of controversy about it. So I got with Jim Bryan, another lawyer in my office, and I called up Joe Engel, the minister to the state prison, to get him involved. I think we had another minister also. And I said to Jim, let's draw up pardons for everybody on death row. You know, pardons is just a piece of paper that says particular things with a signature line for the governor and a section for the secretary of state. So we sat there in my office and typed up, poor secretary had a lot of pressure, typed up a pardon. You know, we had the names of, again, I think it was 7 people on death row, but I'm not sure. However many were on death row, we had their names. That was public record. And we had to type a pardon for each one. I then took those pardons, and Jim and I and Joe Engel and the other person, can't remember who it was, I'm sorry. And we drove out to Governor Blanton's house. No longer in the governor's mansion. He's out and no longer governor, according to Lamar Alexander. We drove out to Governor Blanton's house. We got there about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It's out in Robert E. Lee Drive, what a name, area of town. And there were 30 or 40 cars parked there on the street. All the news media in the state, I guess, was out there. I'm sure there were some FBI and some of the law enforcement cars out there. We finally found a place to park. I'm sure everybody's watching, who are these 4 guys and what are they doing here in suits and ties kind of thing. And we knock on the front door. Mrs. Blanton comes to the door, whom I had met. And I think she recognized me because, again, I'd been a lawyer for her husband at one point. And I said, Miss Blanton, I'm Larry Woods. I'd like to see your husband for a few minutes. It's so important. It's about the death penalty and the people on death row. And I've prepared some pardons in hopes he will sign it. And she just looked at me kind of stunned and said, wait here. She didn't invite us in at that point. She said, well, she was smart. Wait here. Shut the door. 5 minutes later, she comes back and says, okay, come on in. She lets us have a seat in the living room. He'll be with you in a few minutes. A few minutes later, the governor comes out in a bathrobe and a cup of coffee, I guess, in his hand. Greets me. I introduce him to the other people. And he says, Larry, what's this about? And I said, Governor, I've prepared the paperwork for pardons for everybody on death row. And I want you to sign them. I think there's a good legal argument to be made that you are still governor, that you still have the authority of the governor through that one. I think it was tomorrow at noon or tomorrow or whatever. And if you'll sign them, I'm going to go file them with the Secretary of State's office and then file a lawsuit saying these pardons are enforceable. And he said, oh, no, I'm not going to do that. And I said, Governor, this is what you've talked about for years, that you don't believe in the death penalty, that you were going to pardon the people on death row. Here's your opportunity to do it. No, not going to do that. So I gave him 2 arguments by why every governor ought to pardon everybody on every death row. Philosophical one and then sort of a quasi-religious one, and made no progress. We were there talking to him, I don't know, 20 minutes, and he ushered us out. He was polite, very diplomatic about it, but wouldn't even talk about it. So we failed. So 6 months later, a year later, I'm in federal court trying some case. I walked down the hallway during a break. And one of the younger FBI agents who I knew and had been teasing for a couple of years about something walks by me and says, hey, Larry, you made a really good argument to Blanton about the death penalty. I listened to both those arguments you made, and I thought they were pretty strong. And laughs and smiles, and goes on. And so, how does he know about that? He wasn't present. He wasn't. The only people there were Mrs. Blanton, Governor Blanton, my law partner, and these 2 ministers. So I'm certain that the FBI had wiretapped, eavesdropped, and Hal pointed out before when I told the story, he knew nothing about this, and I absolutely believe him. I mean, FBI is notorious for 50 years for wiretapping without court orders, without.
Maybe he was just psychic.
Yeah, maybe. They were wiretapping. Now, were they wiretapping? Why were they wiretapping after he was out as governor? My guess is they'd been wiretapping it for some time and just hadn't removed the tap yet, but who knows? This was the same FBI agent, and then I'll get back to your questions, Miles. This is the same FBI agent who, when he first reported for work to the FBI, right after the first publicity about Eddie Sisk and Pardon the Pro, still wasn't clear to the public or anybody exactly what was going on. Called and made an appointment to see me. Said his name was John Smith or some fictitious name. Shows up for the appointment. Well, said he had a cousin in prison and wanted to come talk about his case. Great, make an appointment. He comes to my office, introduces himself, sits down. I said, what do you want to see me about? He said, well, I need a lawyer. I said, great, I'm available. What's this case about? Well, my cousin was convicted of armed robbery and he's serving 5 years at the state prison. And the family really needs him. We need him at home. We need a pardon for this man. And I said, well, I don't have much experience with pardons, but I understand how they work. Basically, you build a file from the public and people in the community that would persuade the governor and the governor's office of pardons and paroles. This guy would be crime-free in the community and would be stable and be this and that. If you could get the victim in the crime to write a letter, that'd be ideal. But whatever you put together, if you and the family will agree to do a lot of that work with me, I'd be happy to represent your cousin. And he said, great, what's that going to cost us? And I said, my usual hourly rate is, I believe it was then $80 an hour. I quoted him whatever my usual hourly rate was, I believe $80 an hour. I said, it'll cost you $80 an hour. And the way that works is every month I'll send you a bill and I'll itemize how much time I worked on this month and what I did, and total it up and multiply $80 times that many hours. And that's what you owe me that month. And, every month you'll get a bill and we'll go forward on that basis. And he looked at him and said, no, that wasn't what I was expecting. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I need a flat fee. I don't want to get involved somewhere where I won't know how much it is every month or how long it's going to take. I want you to quote me a flat fee that I would have to pay to get a pardon for this guy. And I explained, there's no way I can do that. This might take 2 hours and it might take 50 hours. There's no way to know in advance, especially at this point where I know nothing about the case. And he looked at him and said, I want a guarantee. I'll pay you any price you name right now, but I want to guarantee we're going to get the pardon from the governor. And I looked at him and said, there's no guarantees. This is a legal matter. It's going to be up to the governor and the governor's staff. And I'm sure the warden at the state prison will get some say-so here. And there's no guarantees. Nobody can guarantee that to you. And he said again, oh no, I understand there are guarantees and I want you to guarantee it. And I said, I think it's time for you to leave. I mean, that's not what I do. I'm a lawyer, and what you're asking for is not something a lawyer would do. And he leaves. And I jump up and grab a couple people in my office and walk back to the kitchen, the back office of my office building in a Victorian house. And I point, there he is in the parking lot getting his car. Somebody write that license plate number down. Because I'm thinking this guy has a crook or something wrong's going on. And so I've got the license plate number, and I called a friend in local government, who I'll leave nameless, and say, can you run a license plate number for me? Tell me, and no good and well, this isn't John Smith. Tell me who this guy is. He calls me back 5-10 minutes later and said, Larry, I just can't do it on this license plate. I said, what do you mean you can't do it? I mean, it's no big deal. I just want to know whose license plate, whose car that is. And he said, no, there's some numbers that are restricted that I just can't give out to anybody. And if you think about that a little bit, Larry, you'll figure out who those numbers belong to. Well, yeah, of course, law enforcement. They'd sent this guy in as an undercover operative to see if they could buy a pardon or commutation through me, which made perfect sense from their point of view. My former law partner is the guy they're investigating, so I'd send somebody in too. So every time I'd seen that FBI agent since then, I'd laugh and say, "Yeah, you tried to hire me, didn't you?" He'd smile and say, "Oh, no, you're confused. That wasn't me."
I never heard that story.
Oh, I hadn't told you
No,
that one?
I never, from the FBI.
Richard, it was one of his first assignments.
Okay.
He was the low guy on the totem pole. Good guy, as you know. Yeah, it made sense that they would try that. It made me wonder who else they sent him to see. That's what I need to ask him when I see him. So death penalty. I don't get any of the people on death row pardoned when Lamar Alexander comes in. I do sue Lamar Alexander as governor on behalf of 3 or 4 people, not Mr. Groskos on death row, but honor trustees who were expecting to get a pardon, who had been informed they'd get a pardon and didn't. And I suspect some of their names were probably on the lawyer's governor's desk or Blanton's desk. I don't know, but I sued Governor Alexander saying he violated their rights when he basically took all the pardons that were up there in the governor's office and destroyed them, basically. I'm eventually going to lose that case in the Sixth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals, not because we're wrong, but because of the doctrine of qualified immunity. That's a whole different subject for a different day. Another lawyer files similar suits in state criminal court. He's later going to be U.S. attorney. I can't remember which lawyer it was. Lots and lots of lawsuits here. I went back to work on death penalty cases. I figured out pretty quickly these lawsuits about pardons and parole are really not going to go very far, and I need to focus on the death penalty cases. But because of my involvement in the politics of it and getting interviewed by Channel 5, Channel 4, Channel 2, etc., I'm sure lots of inmates saw me on TV, and all of a sudden I got calls from, I don't know, a dozen inmates at the state prison wanting me to represent them. I guess the real story here is June 1984. Yeah. Ronald Harries, a year earlier, has been convicted of murdering a young woman in a store clerk in East Tennessee and sentenced to the death penalty. And his death penalty date has been set for June 12, I believe it was, mid-June 1984. And this is June 5, the morning of June 5. So we're scheduled to have our first execution in 10 years or so, a week from now. And I'm driving back. I've just taught a constitutional law class at TSU at 8 o'clock that morning. I'm driving back listening to the local news, and they're saying we're going to have our first execution a week from today. And I'm thinking, oh, it's not going to happen. Every lawyer that's experienced there knows there's at least 2 or 3 or 4 more years of appeals that are going to go on. And therefore, one of the judges will issue a stay of the execution next week. And then the newscaster says, and we think this one's really going to happen because we've been advised that Mr. Harris has given up his right to appeals and has notified his attorneys not to appeal his case. I just about drove off the road. We've just been through Gary Gilmore a couple of years earlier. Gary Gilmore was the first guy executed after the Supreme Court rulings. First guy executed after Gregg versus Georgia and Furman versus Georgia, which Furman declared the death penalty unconstitutional. Gary Gilmore gave up his appeals in Utah. And it appeared Harris was doing exactly the same thing. I got back to my office. I called one of the lawyers for Harris and said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Look, nothing we can do. We've been out there and talked to him about it half a dozen times. We can't change his mind. He's absolutely committed to waiving his appeals. Nothing you can do." I then did a little research, 30 minutes or an hour. The first thing I thought of was, okay, let's look up the Gary Gilmore case. And I saw where Mrs. Gilmore, his mother, filed a third-party next friend lawsuit on behalf of Gilmore to try to stop his execution in Utah. That case went all the way to the Supreme Court and lost when Chief Justice Rehnquist issued a memorandum saying she doesn't have the right to file a third-party petition in these circumstances, and therefore the federal court did not have jurisdiction to hear this case. And I sat there and looked at that and thought, well, if Harry's is not going to appeal it, and the Supreme Court in Gilmore said the inmate's mother can't appeal in his place, what can I do? I felt like I had a very real problem. My reaction was, if they execute Mr. Harry's next week, that's going to make it a lot easier for the governor to execute Grosclose or 2 or 3 other people on death row next week and next month. So my client had a very specific interest in Harry's execution. And I thought, I bet if I went out there and talked to Grosclose, he would agree to be a next friend and file a federal court lawsuit to stop the Harry's execution. But how am I going to get around the Gilmore Supreme Court rulings? Well, 10 years later, that became even more of a problem. But for the meantime, I just said, it doesn't matter. We'll file it. We'll see what the state AG argues. So with the help of Bill Merritt and Jim Bryan and Walter Searcy, lawyers in my office, we spent the entire day researching this, stay there probably about midnight, 1 o'clock that night, came back the next day, a Wednesday, and again spent the entire day researching, writing, drafting, because what we had to have was a habeas corpus petition and a federal court complaint and a legal brief supporting a stay of execution, all as one package to take down there. And literally about 4 o'clock, I called the federal court clerk's office, said, I'm getting ready to come down there and file a petition to stop the pending state court execution of Ronald Harry's at death row in Nashville. I've got all the paperwork almost finished. I need another 30 minutes. And she said, well, I'll see if I can get one of the judges to stay late, but I can't guarantee it. Call me back in 30 minutes. I'll let you know if I was successful. So I called her back about 4:45, and she said, I can only catch one judge. The others are already gone when you called me or whatever. Judge Nixon is here, however. I told him that I thought a lawyer was going to file a petition about a death row case that's set for execution next week. He said he would wait a while. What you weren't going to wait all night, obviously. About 5:15, 5:30, I jumped in Walter Searcy's beat up Volvo, 20-year-old Volvo with Bill Merritt in the back seat. And I said, Walt, don't stop. We need to be at the federal courthouse an hour ago. We were on 17th Avenue, federal courthouse at 8th and Broad, so it was an 8-10 block drive. Walt, to his credit, ran every red light, dodged several cars, screeched up to the door of the courthouse, and we went running in. The wonderful woman in the clerk's office, I ought to remember by name and don't, had waited for us. She filed it, walked it down the hall to Judge Nixon's office, and we stood out there in the hall and paced as many lawyers have done over the years in federal court for injunction hearings and stays. And after a while, I can't remember whether Judge Nixon called me down there or whether he just sent word by the clerk. But he basically said, I'm going to accept this filing. I'm going to appoint a guardian ad litem. And now I think it's time for Hal to settle a bit, because did he call you that night or that day?
Yes, and I was in Florida as the first vacation I'd had in years.
That's where it always
I had my family with me and so forth, and he calls me up and says, Hal, I want to appoint you to a case, which is highly unusual. And I said, well, certainly. If you think I should be involved in the case, I'd want to be. And I said, what's the deal? And he said, well, there's 2 young lawyers in here that are arguing that their client should be executed. I said, oh. He said, yes. And I need somebody to be a guardian for this inmate, because I want to be sure he knows what he's doing and so forth. And I said, I'm appointing you then as his guardian. And I said, well, okay, Judge. I said, when
At this time, were you the Attorney General? What were you? You just a lawyer?
private citizen.
Okay,
You're a private practice lawyer.
Yeah, I'm a private lawyer. Yeah.
that's one thing.
Yeah,
Good
I'm just a lawyer. And so I asked Judge.
Wait. He's not just a lawyer. Hal Hardin's the best lawyer in the
Get out of here.
southeastern United States,
It's
maybe the
serious.
country.
Get serious.
Go ahead.
I asked Judge Nixon, I said, well, Judge, I'm down here in Florida this Friday afternoon. When is this fella going to be executed? And he said, I think he said Monday morning. And I said, well, Judge, I don't usually ask the judge this, but I trust you will enter a stay if I file a motion. And he kind of has it, consider it granted. And so
Nobody's telling any of this to me, but go ahead.
so he filed it, and it was one of the most interesting cases, and I think significant cases of that era. I mean, that we actually shut down Unit 6. It was
Which was death row.
Death row. It was an ungodly place. I mean, the temperature in there would be up to 116 degrees. They smoked in there. You could see the nicotine running down the wall with the sweat, and no air conditioning. They never got out of death row except maybe 20 minutes a day. It was really a hellhole, and it had some really bad characters in there. I remember because I had met James Earl Ray because I investigated him when I was assistant DA. But anyway, he was there, but he turned his back to everybody and told everybody later, told my client, said, Ray is saying you shouldn't trust Hardin. He used to be an assistant DA. So
But he spit at me when we did the death row tour.
Yeah.
He wrote me twice asking me to represent him and never even bothered to respond.
He was a character. But anyway, I got to say, it was one of the easiest lawsuits I ever tried in my life. When you think about it, I mean,
Everything went right.
everything went absolutely right. And the truth be told, every governor that was involved and every attorney general was really on our side.
Yes.
They wanted Unit 6 shut down,
Yes.
but it was unpopular. And so they figured that, well, Judge Nixon, he can do it. He's a federal judge, but everybody was kind of on our side.
I think that's
The
exactly
easiest witness I ever handled in my life was that Warden Dutton.
right. Yeah,
I mean,
he's a good guy.
Yeah, good guy. He answered every question exactly right. And
Yeah, the lawsuit, I agree with the characterization Hal's put on it. And I'm not one of the two young lawyers that was sitting there in the judge's office. Those were the two lawyers representing Harry's that Harry's had told don't file the appeal. We had a series of evidentiary hearings. And just to illustrate what Hal said about how easy this lawsuit was in so many ways, we needed to prove, one, that Harry's was incompetent to make a decision about whether to waive his appeals or not, or it's his mental stability, mental issues. Two, we need to prove, as it turns out, they had him heavily sedated with drugs. The president of the American Psychiatric Association is going to come down, testify for us, and he testified they were putting enough tranquilizers in him to knock an elephant over. Number three, we had to prove that the court had jurisdiction over a next friend proceeding here. We need psychiatric testimony, which is difficult in any kind of case, but under these kind of fast-moving circumstances, even more so. I called a woman, Dr. Dorothy Lewis, who was the lead professor in the psychiatry department at Yale University, also taught at NYU, was on staff at Bellevue Mental Hospital. And I said, I've read a couple of your articles on inmates. We need you to come testify here in Nashville about Ron Harris. And she came. She didn't get a dime. She paid her own way down here. She was a terrific witness. Then I called the president of the American Psychiatric Association. He paid his own way. Dr. Otto Billig testified, of course, the dean of psychiatrists in Nashville, and Dr. Harold Jordan who at that point was head of the Meharry Medical College in town, but who had been Commissioner of Mental Health under Governor Alexander, testified for us. Good evidence of what you're saying, that the governor, everybody else was really on our side. Halfway through a lot of the strategizing and presenting evidence, we figured out, once they take the inmate Harry's off the drugs, and we can't use that as an arguing point. If he's again going to say he wants to waive his appeals, what's our argument going to be? And so we started focusing on the conditions of Unit 6. Unit 6 was the physical building at the state prison that housed all the death row prisoners. And the conditions were horrific, like Hal was describing a minute ago. Plus, they're racially segregated. I mean, this was like a 16th century poorhouse prison that Dickens would have written about. It was just that bad. Hal, I think, is the one that came up with the idea that we need to ask the judge to literally take a walking tour through death row. Judge Nixon.
I knew that would persuade him.
Yeah, you were exactly right. The judge, his law clerks, one of whom's a federal judge today, great judge. All the lawyers, and there were 2 or 3 lawyers from the AG's office. There were Hal and me, and at least one other lawyer from my office in all these sessions. And then we had the 2 original lawyers representing Harry's. I guess we had 10 or 12 lawyers.
Well, not to mention all the law enforcement that came.
Oh, yes.
U.S. Marshals.
U.S. Marshals.
It was quite an entourage.
It was a extremely complicated case, but as Hal said, went very, very easily. Judge Nixon rules in our favor on basically every issue. And I had to say, Wayne Newell, the lead for the Attorney General's office, was a very, very good lawyer and one of the most ethical, honest lawyers I've ever dealt with in litigation. I got ready one day to file a motion with the judge saying, I want notice if anybody's going to be put on death watch out there. There were about 100 people on death row at that point. In other words, I don't want to have to get a week's notice again about this, because at this point we're class action, and to a large degree, Hal's very focused on taking care of Harry's because he's guardian for Harry. I'm very focused on the entire death row because I'm the one that brought the class action. And Wayne called me up and said, look, Larry, don't file that motion. I'll pledge to you, I will personally give you notice of anybody that's getting close. I don't want a week's notice either to go back to court. Don't worry about it. I didn't file it. The 1 or 2 things that came up, he did give me timely notice on. If he'd stayed on it, he moved to Indiana and took over death row for Indiana. If he'd stayed on it, we'd have had a tougher time on the field, etc.
Well, Harry's came around to the point of view. I kept talking to him about he really wasn't. When they started shaving his legs, he started really thinking this is serious. And
I never talked to Harry's. Never met him. So I've been walking through death row and never talked to him. I was counting on you, and you knew you were going to. I knew you would take care of that.
He said something when he and I were going to court. He said, Mr. Hardin, he said, I don't want you walking with me. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I killed a clerk up in Kingsport or wherever. And he says, that wouldn't surprise me if the father of that girl that I killed didn't kill me on the way to court. And he said, I want to tell you something. I believe that he's justified in killing me. I don't believe in the death penalty, the way the state executes people. But I do believe in this it's really an old ancient theory, an eye for eye, in essence. I would not blame him in the least if he killed me when we're coming to court tomorrow.
Over the 10, 15 years, all this death row was going on. I had somebody 2 different times shoot into my office. Once shot out, I had one of those front doors that half of the glass shot out the window glass, and I replaced it. Then I had a big front window in the front office where Walter Searcy was, and they shot into that window, and it's still, up until they tore that building down a couple of years ago in the Nashville boom, it still had that bullet hole in the top of that window. to remind me of the point Ron Harris was making. Yeah, we've had a lot of great lawyers in Nashville work on death row cases. Henry Martin, Don Dawson, Paul Botte, Kelly Henry particularly, through Hal and Mi's work on Gross, Close, and Harry's and their work, we had no execution. I can't
Mike,
hear you.
can you tell us about Mike Passno?
Oh, yes. Mike Passano was one of those lawyers that helped so much on death row. And I've left out a dozen others. These are mostly lawyers who, they really lay awake at night worrying. If you hire me to represent you on a $5,000 debt, I'm going to worry about it. I'm going to make sure I do a good job. If we win, great. If we lose, I'm going to feel unfortunate about it. I'm going to move on the next day. Lawyers who lose death row cases are very troubled about it, and should be. They deserve a lot of credit. We stopped executions in the state from 1978 until 2000 when Governor Sundquist carried out the first execution that had been done in 38 years, I believe. Governor Bredesen then executed 5 people on death row. We've only had 12 or 13 executions. He executed almost half of it. And just when he executed Philip Workman, let me talk about Workman for a minute and we'll move on from death row. Workman was a Vietnam veteran who got chopped up by a bomb and shrapnel in Vietnam. In a year and a half in the hospital, he got hooked on heavy drugs. And then they released him to live on the streets with his drug habit. And I'm not trying to excuse what Workman did, but that's the reality. His life was robbing Wendy's and McDonald's type places to get money for drugs. He walked in a Wendy's late at night in Memphis, and in the process of holding him up, the police arrived from a silent alarm, 2 police cars. Workman goes running out of the Wendy's and turns and runs down an alley, and 3 policemen give chase, and within seconds, 1 policeman's dead. And they arrest Workman for the armed robbery and the murder of the police officer. A lot of question about whether the bullet fragments that are recovered from the dead officer's body are from Workman's gun or from one of the other police officers' gun. Never, been 3 or 4 different court hearings over the years before Workman's execution about who really shot and killed the police officer. Even worse, in terms of putting this guy to death, is the star witness at trial. Is a guy that Memphis Crime Stoppers pays $5,000 or $10,000 to because he came forward and provided primary evidence against Workman. He testifies at trial that he was out there in the in the parking lot of the Wendy's, and he saw the police arrive, saw Workman come running out of the Wendy's, could see down the alley. He saw the 3 police officers chase Workman, and he witnessed Workman stop in the alley, turn around, point his gun, and fire. Saw the fire, flame, not flame, but that kind of thing of the gun. And he saw the police officer drop. Dynamite evidence if you're the prosecutor, isn't it? Well, I represented Workman, not at trial, but on his first 10 years worth of appeals. He then fired me and went with a different set of lawyers. Long story there about whose strategy was better. The new lawyers' best part of their strategy was they had federal funding to find that star witness 15 years, 20 years after the trial. And they found him in Tucson, Arizona, and they interviewed him on videotape saying, I made the whole thing up. My girlfriend and I talked about it. We needed money. And here was this ad running from Crime Stoppers saying we're going to pay, I forget, $5,000, $10,000 to any witness that comes forward with evidence that leads to the conviction of this guy. I can do that. I called the Memphis police and told them I'm that guy. Where'd I collect my money? And when they the defense lawyers asked him, they said, well, how did you know the details that you gave? He said, easy. I read it in the newspaper. And then the police officer let me read the police file. And I testified to what I'd read in the newspaper and in the police file and just made up the part about I actually saw it. I wasn't there. I didn't see anything. we executed that man. Now, which time was he telling the truth? I don't know. Nobody knows. I mean, he's just like workman. He's out there bumming through life, trying to make money and survive for good and for bad. And those are the kind of things that lawyers argue when they argue reasonable doubt and juries acquit. Those are the kind of things certainly that a governor, a warden, etc., should think through 50 or 100 times before they throw the switch to execute somebody. That the primary witness at trial recanted his testimony and said that he made it up. Now, later on at subsequent hearings, he's going to say, no, those defense lawyers pressured me. I lied to them. I made up the stuff on the videotape. Again, that's what lawyers call reasonable doubt, is when you get into those kind of disputes with the fact witness. You know, it's why we shouldn't have one of the reasons we shouldn't have the death penalty. If I'm the judge and I sentence Workman to 10 years in prison or 30 years in prison, and this witness shows up 15 years later saying I lied and I made it up, I can partially solve that problem. Workman's still out there serving time at the state prison. I can let him go and reimburse him for wrongful time served. If I execute him, there's no going back. There's no getting around that we, the people of Tennessee, executed Philip Workman under Phil Bresson's administration at a time when we all knew or should have known that there was major reasonable doubt about Workman's conviction. Does that happen in other cases? We had a guy named House on death row in Tennessee for 25 years for rape, murder in East Tennessee he didn't commit, which basically everybody that looked at the proceedings eventually understood he didn't commit it. Primary evidence against him was the blood testing by the FBI at the FBI National Laboratory. And it was the victim's blood, and it was on his blue jeans. And finally, about 3 years after the original trial, 22 years before he's going to get off death row, we all learned that when the local sheriff in Upper East Tennessee sent the box of evidence to the FBI to be tested, he put the vial of victim's blood in with the blue jeans. And when the FBI opened it, the vial was cracked. Guess what? They found blood on his blue jeans. And that was the primary evidence at trial. I mean, this is just an outrage that the DA went forward with the trial after learning that. This was an outrage that the Attorney General's office kept fighting this case for 20 years after they learned that the FBI blood report was worthless. Yeah, I mean, we do bad things. You know, FBI and the AG are just like me. They do bad things at times. They do stupid things at times. The difference is, in the examples I'm giving, is when I do bad and stupid things, I try to step up and say, hey, I screwed this up. I'm sorry. We got to start over.
You listen to that every year.
FBI, the AG, the police, the sheriff, you know, they need a lesson every week, because we read and hear too many of these kind of cases, that you got to step forward when you do it wrong. The New Orleans DA for 30 years, whose son is the famous singer, whose name I can't remember, has the worst reputation in the nation for Brady violations. He's now finally retired. New Orleans is a place you never want to get arrested. They use a lot of fake evidence in criminal cases in New Orleans. Think what that does in all the legitimate cases that prosecutors and police officers in New Orleans are trying to win, where all the evidence is legitimate and real, and the guy really is a bad guy, really should be convicted and punished. And everybody in town who pays attention knows, oh yeah, this is the DA's office that's constantly faking or hiding or concealing evidence. It means they're going to lose a lot of legitimate cases. So this is not just me being a bleeding heart liberal. You know, this affects all of us every day. When we consistently do it wrong in these death penalty cases, it has an influence on other trial juries in other cases. Okay, I'm going to shut up about death penalty.
Well, I got two personal questions. Your brother, Frank Woods, was one of the unique people in Nashville, maybe in the state. He did a lot of things. He in the news media, they called him the child wonder. Someday he'll be governor, that kind of thing.
I remember.
He owned so many businesses. He bought magazine companies and TV programs. I mean, he was an astounding debater, an incredible guy, and he died too young. What was it like to be the younger brother to somebody like Frank Woods?
Well, that's an easy one to answer. It was, we'll ask him as my grandson. Yeah. When our father died young, Frank was in 7th grade. It was the first week of 7th grade for him, first week of 4th grade for me. You know, that shaped our lives. The other thing that shaped our lives for both of us was being on the debate teams. He got to the national finals his junior in college. I got to the national finals my junior and senior year in college. And debate taught us how to strategize, taught us how to organize, taught us how to start at this point and get to that point. Our father's death at an early age made Frank grow up very early. And therefore, I had the typical younger brother syndrome of I wanted to go every place Frank went, do everything Frank did, hang out with Frank. Frank had the typical older brother syndrome of get away from here, you're too young, you're a nuisance, you're in the way. But that was especially heightened with Frank in the sense that from 7th grade on, he felt like it was up to him to bring money into the family, to be responsible, to be an adult. Frank became an adult when he was in the 7th grade. I didn't because I was just too much younger, you know, 4th grade, but I tried to follow his footsteps. Therefore, I went to work 20 hours a week starting in 6th grade, and I joined the debate team, and everything he did, I did. His interest in politics, I'll be interested in politics. All right, I'll tell you part of the story here that's not public. Frank and I and my mother used to have these horrific arguments at the supper table every night about racial issues. My mother grew up in rural Berrien County, Kentucky. My mother grew up with all the wrong, terrible attitudes about race. She came around, and not because of the stuff I would argue with her about at supper, I don't think, although I'm sure that helped some. But when Frank and I both started bringing Black friends home to spend the night or to eat supper, my mother came around. But therefore, when Frank was in high school and junior high school, he agreed with my mom. You know, this is my mom. My mom thinks X. Therefore, that must be it. That must be real. And a little brother arguing the opposite, yeah, that just reinforces it, really, because he's a little brother. What does he know? Frank came around with Ross Bass. When Frank called me and said, I've gotten 2 offers to work in political campaigns this year, 1964, one for a guy named Howard Baker, who's going to run for the Republican U.S. Senate, and the other from a congressman named Ross Bass, who's going to run for the Democratic nomination for the Senate. And I said, well, which offer are you going to take? And Frank said, I think I'm going to take Ross Bass's offer. And I said, why? He said, because Bass says he's going to vote for the Civil Rights Act. I said, Frank, that's the best news I've ever heard from you in my life. So Frank grew up. He went off to college to Vanderbilt, where Lionel Barrett talked about in the same interview, where they were having a public vote over whether to integrate. And one of the people, along with Lamar Alexander and Lionel, that was pushing for that was Frank. Frank grew up. And therefore, he and I became very close. He and I and Jane started our law firm together. The news I particularly remember was the year or so I started the law firm, Arkansas saying which 3 of these law partners are going to run for mayor. Yeah. And it was going to be Frank. He eventually didn't, but that's what we were all planning.
And governor later on.
Yes, and governor later on. Frank and I had falling out about the bank. And the butchers. I couldn't stand the butchers. But then we got back together again. In fact, I can remember you and I and Frank meeting 2 or 3 times after the bank got shut down, and to help him out on some stuff. And Frank used to be a basketball player. Do you know that? He started, did he tell you what a great star he was?
Of course.
He started 3 years for the high school team, and his story was our team would have won the state championship except Andy Winfrey moved to Knoxville and was on the all-state, team up in Knoxville. And the other forward moved to Mount Juliet and played for Mount Juliet senior year. And their star center, Charles Anderson, got married and was ineligible to play. That's the only reason they didn't win the state championship. My memory of Frank is I went to every game he played, of course. And in the playoffs to get to the state tournament his senior year, the guy playing for Central, I can't remember his name, that Frank was guarding, scored 47 points. And so after the I said, Frank, what happened? And Frank just shook his head, said, that guy's good. Then Frank went out for the basketball team at Vanderbilt and open tryout, and they had scrimmage the first day. And that guy ran over Frank too. Frank said, I ain't got time for this. I'm about to go hit the books and get the basketball thing. He wound up, the guy wound up being all SEC. If Frank had drawn a different player in the scrimmage, he would have been on the Vanderbilt team. Frank and I became very close in the 1990s again and throughout the rest of his life because he wanted to go down to the Vanderbilt gym and play basketball. Didn't he ever invite you to play?
No.
Oh,
He knew I couldn't.
he picked on me. I mean, I couldn't even make the junior high basketball team. They said, Larry, you got to go over to the Vanderbilt gym with me every night. We went 4 or 5 nights a week and play basketball with the college kids, not with the old guys like us. We were both in our 50s at that point. We were out there playing with the college kids 4 and 5 nights a week. And he did pretty well. I was crummy. I was awful. But Frank he had a hook shot they couldn't block. He was like Kareem Abdul, but he was as short as I was.
Tell them about the story about the white men telling what to do.
So our African-American commissioner of elections, Michael, I can't remember Michael's last name. McDonald, thank you. Showed up one Saturday to play. We played early Saturday mornings. The college kids wouldn't show up early Saturday mornings. Of course, they were asleep in the dorm. So Frank recruited folks like you and me come Saturday morning. So we're playing scrimmage, and there's this black guy just shooting by himself on the next court. So Frank, being Frank, turns out and says, "Come join us." Michael was pretty good. He played for MTSU in college. So Mike was pretty good. And second or third game that morning, all of a sudden, I'm playing, but I wasn't paying a lot of attention. All of a sudden, mid-court, Michael and another guy and Frank are in this furious argument mid-court. I don't know what had happened, whether it had been a foul or who knows. But they're just in a furious argument. I mean, I was afraid it was going to be a fight between the other guy and Michael. And Frank saying, "Now just calm down. Everybody just slow down. He'll be okay." Frank's being the peacemaker that he's always good at. And Michael looks at him and says, "I'm tired of old white men telling me what to do in this life." And I thought, oh no. And Frank looks at him and says, "Me too." And Michael burst out laughing. So Michael becomes a dear friend. Frank was really talented at providing leadership for people.
Well, he was.
And he provided that for me as
a lot of people. He died much too young.
Much too young.
Well, let me ask you this. You also coached a lot of candidates on how to debate. Did you not?
Yes.
Who did you?
Yes.
Can you share that with us?
My stars on who I coached in political debate were a guy named Jimmy Carter, and a guy named Al Gore Jr., and a guy named Phil Bredesen. And I coached some other people running for state legislature and that kind of thing, but those were the 3 worth talking about, I guess. In 1970, I was director of litigation for Atlanta Legal Aid. And Clifford Allen's going to make me move back up here with his daughter I was married to run his campaign for mayor in 71 and then for Congress in 75. Yeah, 75. Somebody at the office, my legal aid, asked me one day, "Who you for governor?" And I said, "Well, I hadn't been paying much attention who's running." And it was Carl Sanders, a former governor, running against Jimmy Carter. And I said, "Well, I'll think about it and let you know." And later that day, I saw my college debate coach, a guy named Glenn Pelham. I said, "Who you for between Sanders and Carter?" He said, "Oh, I supported Sanders in 64 or whenever it was he ran and won, 62. But I'm at to be for Carter this time because when I was in the state Senate," my debate coach says, "I shared a desk with Jimmy Carter." So I said, good enough for me. I'll be for Carter. So I volunteered a little bit. I met him once or twice. His wife, Rosalind, everybody knows who Rosalind was, don't they? Calls me the day after the election. I think, isn't this nice? I didn't do that much. She's calling to thank me. And instead, she's calling and said, Larry, I need you to do one more thing for us. I said, okay. Our gardener got arrested last week in Atlanta. Our gardener in Plains was in Atlanta weekend and last month, got arrested. And when he went to court, he pled guilty. He thought he was going to get a suspended sentence, etc. And instead, they've sentenced him to a year in the county jail. Can you do something about this? And I'm thinking, what am I going to do? I'm not practicing criminal law. Legal aid doesn't handle criminal law. That's the public defender in Atlanta. And I said, well, Mr. Carter, I mean, I'll be glad to go over and read the record, but if he pled guilty, I don't think there's anything anybody can do. I go over and read the record. It's typical 1-page, 2-page record. Defendant appeared on this date, entered plea guilty, signed by the judge and the clerk, and nothing to it. I called the DA who handled the case. He said, I don't even remember it. I mean, you know. I said, well, is there any way we could get a new hearing on the sentencing? Would you agree to that? No, I'm not going to agree to that. So I called her back and said, look, I just don't think there's anything can be done. She said, sure, you're the smartest lawyer I know. You shouldn't even know me, of course. She's being nice and trying to persuade me. I just appreciate so much if you do some work on this and try to do something. So I went to the law library and pretty quickly found the 1967 Supreme Court decision saying that the way everybody in Nashville and Atlanta and every place else is doing it doesn't comply with the Constitution. If you're going to accept a guilty plea, it's got to be a factual basis on the record. Which nowadays, of course, as we all know, the standard ritual is the judge does say, all right, Mr. Defendant, pleading guilty. You've heard what the DA summarized charges as. Do you agree that that's what happened? Yes, Your Honor. And did you, in fact, commit those facts? Yes, Your Honor. Or else the judge doesn't take the plea. Well, 1970 in Atlanta, they were just saying, all right, on guilty plea, I'll sign it, and you're gone. So I filed a habeas corpus. I figured out a habeas corpus is a civil action, isn't it? Technically. So I filed a habeas corpus for the Carter's gardener and got him freed. And of course, they weren't going to retry it or anything else, just the end of it. So 4 years later, Carter's getting ready to go out. He's in his last year in office. And my college debate organization, which I helped start with my partner, Charles Clark, we've become one of the 2 or 3 premier debate organizations in the nation. And we present an annual award called the Speaker of the Year Award. And they were giving it to Jimmy Carter, the outgoing governor of Georgia. And so they called and said, Larry, we remember you volunteered in this campaign. Why don't you come down and make the presentation to him? So I did. So we had breakfast together that morning. The presentation ceremony was going to be like 10 o'clock. And I turned around to him as we were seated at the head down. I turned around to him and said, Governor, I've heard you might run for president. And he smiled and said, I've heard some of that talk, but it's just talk. I said, well, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about if they ever have another TV debate in the presidential contest, call me. I could help you. And he looked at me and said, what are you doing between now and 10 o'clock? I said, sitting here talking to you. And he said, great, let's go to an empty room and talk. So for about half an hour, I coached Carter on how to do a TV debate and what the strategy should be and that kind of thing. And in fact, he and Ford did reinstitute debates, and we've had them ever since.
Well, you know, you must have done a good job because all the pundits say that Carter won overwhelmingly the first debate. But what happened in the second debate, our friend, quotation, a fellow named Paul Corbin, who was Bobby Kennedy's hatchet man, stole the book. And there's a recent book that came out, I can't remember the name of it, that talks about that. The entire chapter about how
Corbin stole it.
Corbin stole the book and turned the tide in that race.
Yeah.
Astounding.
That's exactly what happened. Then Frank's the one that set me up to coach Al Gore, and I didn't really coach him. I had a small role in coaching him in his first vice presidential debate against Dan Quayle and Admiral Stockdale. I can't remember his name. We did it out at a farm near Lebanon. We had 4 sessions with Al Gore. He had a guy from Washington who headed up his communications in the campaign who did an excellent job. He had 3 or 4 assistants, Jim Neal and me. And we put him through, 5 or 6 mock practice debates. And that really is the key. Any of the listening out there that need advice on political debate, the key is practice, practice, practice. The reason incumbents typically don't do well in debates, like Biden, like Obama in his first debate when he was running as an incumbent, is they didn't practice. They thought being president or holding the office was more important than doing their duty was more important. No, more important is practice, practice, practice if you want to do well. I'll give you a few other tips if you call me. So we had a lot of fun. Gore was under a lot of pressure, you could tell, as anybody would be. Sarah Lee and I then went down to Atlanta with the Gore team to watch the vice presidential debate that was held at Georgia Tech that night. And Gore then held a get together after the debate that night. We were there to 2 o'clock in the morning. It was late hours for us, for me at least. Gore did really well in those vice presidential debates. He got bad advice in his presidential campaign. Same thing. And Johnny Hayes talked about this a lot.
No Roy Neal.
Johnny Hayes was the finest political person I ever worked with. And I met him through helping Al Gore Jr., vice presidential and presidential. And as Johnny Hayes said, they hired the wrong person to be the campaign manager. They stopped paying attention to people like Roy Neal, who got you to this point, and stopped paying attention to Johnny Hayes. They just had the wrong people in 2000. Bredeson's an interesting story. Bredeson's running for governor. And when he ran for governor the first time in 94, the first time in 94, I spent one afternoon helping him. And the problem was a mistake candidates often make. He invited me and 5 other people, no, 6 or 7 other people to come in and sit in a room with him for a couple hours and advise him about debate, which means he got 7 different strategies and 7 conflicting. I mean, it's not helpful. I remember the same thing happened with Megan Beer when she was running for mayor. She overcame it, but she invited a room full of us to advise her. And I sat there the whole time thinking, I'm just not going to say a word to her. It's just pointless. And then at the very end, I finally said, okay, let me go ahead and be the bad guy in the room and offend you for life, Megan. I want to talk to you about how you're dressing for these debates. And gave her 5 minutes. Let me tell you, White, how you should dress. You can imagine how popular, but she was making smart. She paid attention and followed my advice and won the debate. Bredeson was different. I was not involved in I was for Bredeson, but he was running against Van Hillary. I was not really involved in any campaigns right then. And I'm at home, and Bredeson had his first debate that week and just did terrible. And the debate was on health care. I'm sure his whole campaign team was saying, you're going to crush this congressman who knows nothing about health care. You're one of the world experts on health care, Mr. Bredeson. You're going to do great. He was incredibly bad. He sat there instead of standing and read from note cards. It was just awful. Charles Bone, one of the Johnny Hayes people, was in Sarah Lee's bookstore the next day. And Sarah Lee goes up to him and says, I'm going to hold you personally responsible if he doesn't do better at the next debate. The next morning, Bredeson's guy, Dave Cooley, calls me at 6 a.m. and says, Larry, we really need your help in this campaign. And I said, well, okay, I'm for Bredesen. What do you mean? He said, we want you to help him on these debates. I said, when's the next debate? And Dave says, tomorrow night in Knoxville. And I said, well, we better start soon then. And he said, good, when can you be here? And I said, I can be there in an hour. I'll have Bredesen here. So I'm sitting there at a table in Dave Cooley's office. Dave Cooley, Byron Tarver, and me and one or two other people, and here comes Bredesen and walks over to me and I'm sitting there, leans down about this far from me and says, "Where the hell were you when I needed you the other night?" And I said, "Well, if you show that same aggression in your next debate, you'll do a lot better." So they did it right. They had a television set so that I could see him perform, not sitting there, but could watch the TV set to see how the audience was going to see it. And he and I spent the day together, then came back the next day and spent the morning together working on it. And then at 1 o'clock or so, we were going to fly to Knoxville on a private plane. And I said to him, I don't fly on private planes. I used to do that in campaign, went through 2 or 3 really scary experiences, and just decided I'm going to ride with Hal Hardin on the bus as he drove Hooker around in the 66 campaign. And they said, "Look, no choice. We got it reserved. Come on, it'll be okay." They talked me into it. So as we walk out the Smyrna airport, as we're walking up the 2 or 3 steps to get into the private plane, Bredesen's right ahead of him. He gets to the top step. He turns around and looks at me and says, "Oh, Larry, did I tell you we got this plane on a low bid contract?" No good, someone said. We go to the debate at Knoxville College in Knoxville. Bredesen's great, did everything I advised him on, really did a terrific job. Clear winner from start to finish. We go back out and get in the rented, or we were in a van. There were about 8 of us, all the campaign people. And so we're driving off from Knoxville College and we stop for gas. And one of the 8 walks in the stop and go market and buys a 6-pack of beer. I don't drink, so I wasn't involved. The driver was smart enough not to take a beer. The other 6, including Bredesen, all pop open a beer as we pull out of the gas station and come that close to hitting a state trooper. We're all sitting there thinking, "Oh no." We're all thinking this headline's going to look awful bad tomorrow. Trooper comes up to the driver's window. Driver's license, registration, insurance, please. The driver provides all that. The state trooper looks at all of us, hands it all back to the driver and says, "Do better. Don't let a single one of them pass one of those beers up here. And Governor, I hope you win."
Well, Larry, looking back on your professional life, if you had to do it over again, what would you change, if anything?
I would do no private practice of law. I should have worked for legal aid and a public defender office or any of the, institution. I should have come work for you at the U.S. Attorney's Office. It would have been a great experience and really benefit me. I ran a public interest law firm as a private law firm, had great lawyers that I practiced with, the best of whom was Ron Routson. He saved the State Employees Association. I spent a lot of time representing nonprofits. I represented the National Baptist Congress, world's largest religious congress. I represented the Tennessee State Employees Association, helped found it for 30 years. I spent more than 20 years as the general counsel for the Nashville chapter of the NAACP, and therefore I represented the first Black principal in the Sumner County school system when he was arrested for attempted murder. I represented the first Black principal in the Williamson County school system when they tried to run him out of town. I represented the first Black coach in Clarksville when they tried to run him out. Judge Tom Wiseman took care of that real quick on the injunction hearing. Wiseman said, "I've been to the Clarksville system. I know what Montgomery County is like. Mr. Woods, I've heard enough of that. I'm granting your injunction." You know what Wiseman was like. What I would change would be I wouldn't be worried about meeting the salaries and the overhead and the rent every month. I should have stuck to exactly what I wanted to do, which was social justice. I tried. I think the first women's employment discrimination case in the federal courts here. I tried a lot of race discrimination cases in federal court here. I tried the Jackie Brooks case, the 19-year-old that the Nashville police officer shot and killed in front of her home. And that was just a terrible, terrible case. Shot her in the back,
Hmm.
4 times. And Nashville Police Department issued press releases for a year saying this is a good shooting. She was threatening the officer with a knife. No, she wasn't. She was walking back into her home. Somebody needs to clean up the Nashville Police Department. Mayor Freddie O'Connell, you need to clean up the Nashville Police Department. There are a lot of good officers there. You need to clean up the bad ones and reorient their philosophy over there.
What about teaching, Miles?
What else can I talk about? I think we've talked about more politics than we need to. I think the one other thing I'd like to say other than representing NAACP and what a privilege that was is I handled 500 or 600 draft cases in the 1960s. First year law school, I missed draft for 4 years with a college deferment. I've now got a deferment that's going to last 3 years through law school, which means I'm going to get drafted the month I graduate law school, basically. First year law school, they put a note up on the bulletin board saying, anybody interested in learning anything about the law of the selective service system of the draft, we're going to hold a free seminar Monday nights for the next 6 weeks. I was there. I was the first one there. I didn't want to be late for that. There were about a dozen of us there out of about 150 in the class. And I was stunned more weren't turning out. Of course, what it was what Bill Clinton and George Bush and people like that benefited from. They all went to the National Guard. Anybody ever tells you, yeah, I served in the 60s in the National Guard, that was a way out of being in the military. That was a way to avoid going to Vietnam. Don't get fooled by that talk. The National Guard is perfectly reputable, and I'm sure they worked hard. The few things they did in the National Guard, but everybody my age understood in the 60s and 70s, the National Guard was the way out. My way out was going to this course taught by Joe Tuchinski, sponsored by the Quakers, the Friends, who were pacifists. He taught me what the law was about selective service. And I had to pay for the course. He explained on the front end on the course, your payment for the course is you're going to spend 50 hours counseling low-income students at Chicago State University how to avoid the draft. Great. And I did. And I counseled every lawyer at Atlanta Legal Aid and 500 other people in Chicago and Atlanta. Word got out quickly. If you want to avoid the draft, there's this lawyer at Atlanta Legal Aid that can tell you how to do it. I never lost a case. The reason I never lost a case was a guy named Michael Tiger, who started publishing a law book called The Selective Service Law Reporter. It was like U.S. Law Week if you were practicing law in those days. With every draft case from around the nation, including all the administrative law judge rulings, and a copy of all the medical standards that they use to pass or fail on the medical when you show up, and how to handle it if you're going to represent Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, when he refused to step forward. I had several clients refuse to step forward at induction, and I would file habeas corpus petitions for them and get them freed from federal prison because the draft boards never did it right. Never. In 500, 600, I never saw a single time they did it right and followed the law. And I felt sorry for them. I mean, they had one full-time secretary over at the Customs House in Nashville where the draft board met. Draft board was 3 people appointed by the governor's office who met once a month for an hour, maybe 2 hours, to select who was going to be drafted that, get the 1A notice that month. They had no clue what the law was. They weren't lawyers. They weren't trained in any of this. No one offered to provide them any training. They were strictly relying on whatever the secretary said. We need 100 1A notices go out this month. Here are the next 100 names on the list. Okay, send it to them. No, that's not the way the law, the regulations, or the rules said to do it, but that's the way every draft board in the nation was doing it. So Michael Tiger did a great service for thousands of young men in publishing the Selective Service Law Reporter. His story, let me take 1 minute, was he was a top graduate of the University of California, Berkeley Law School, was going to be a law clerk to Justice William O. Douglas on the Supreme Court. You know how well he did in law school to get that job. He shows up in Washington a month after he graduated, and Justice Douglas's office says, well, you got to go over and get security clearance through the FBI before we can put you on the payroll, because Supreme Court deals with national security matters in some cases. He couldn't get a security clearance. Hoover personally called him into his office and says, Mr. Tiger, you were out there radicalizing students at Berkeley. You led a lot of those demonstrations. There's no way I'm going to give you a security clearance. So you can kiss that job goodbye. Language was a little more vulgar than that, but that's what Tiger says happened. Tiger was out of a job. So while he was looking for a job, he went over to the Library of Congress and researched the Selective Service system and wound up publishing his law report. Thank you, Mr. Hoover. One good thing you did at least.
What about teaching?
Teaching. I had benefited for 50 years from teaching constitutional law and criminal law at Tennessee State University. I've benefited two ways. One, the students keep me young and on my toes. And two, teaching the classes every session forces me to stay current, whether I want to or not. Practicing law has been a privilege. It's been full of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'm not talking about my clients. I'm talking about other lawyers and judges. Most lawyers have been good people to deal with. But then I had one lawyer about 5 years ago come to my office, take a deposition. And when he opened up his briefcase, in there he had a can of Coca-Cola, a sandwich, a bottle of water, a box of Kleenex. And I looked at him and I said, why'd you bring all that stuff? And he looked at me and said, most offices I go to take depositions, they won't give me these kind of things. They won't give me Kleenex. They won't give me a pad of paper. They won't give me a glass of water. So I've learned the hard way. I've got to bring it. And I thought, gee, have the lawyers gotten that bad? And unfortunately, some of them, maybe many of them have. And I want to urge every law student or lawyer watching this, we need to be nice to everybody. Nice to our clients, nice to juries, nice to judges, and nice to other lawyers. It doesn't cost anything. Harassing other lawyers is not a road to success. Be nice to other lawyers. I'd like to say some things about some judges, but the judges who were really bums that I were in front of are all dead or retired, so there's no point in blasting them here on video. But I do want to say to judges in general, be kinder to lawyers. You know, I know you're the judge and therefore what you say goes. You can say that in a nice way as well as a harsh way. And when you get rookie lawyers in your court that clearly, you know, haven't learned yet what they're doing, be kind to them. Try to guide them. Don't just chew them out because they don't have 20 years experience. 2 or 3 of the best lawyers I ever appeared in front of, 2 or 3 of the best judges I ever appeared in front of, I saw just attack some young lawyers. There's no excuse for that. None. We're all young, we're all new, we're all rookies at some point. Help them out. Don't punish them. And judges, I know you're busy. I know you're overworked. I'm not sure about underpaid anymore. The salaries have gotten up there in recent years. But I know you're overworked and got more than you can say grace over. But you've got to pay attention. When a Ron Harry's petition walks in your office, you do need to stay late and hear that petition to stay a death penalty execution. And I want you to do better than Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell, after retired from the Supreme Court, said, yeah, I look back and realized I got several of my votes wrong, including votes on the death penalty. You know, take the extra time, no matter how inconvenient that is to the lawyers and to yourself, make sure you're getting it right the first time. Be a lawyer like Hal Hardin if you're a new lawyer. Hal Hardin, again, I wasn't teasing earlier when I said, is the best lawyer in the southeastern United States, probably in the nation. Emulate Hal Hardin. Watch his videos. Pay attention to what he's put out in public about how to practice law. he did it right every time.
Would you repeat that?
No, not unless you pay me.
Thank you.
Al's one of the true good guys. Miles Woods, thank you for being here today to help me with this. Sarah Lee Woods, thank you for everything. Do well out there. Stay healthy. Don't take your profession home with you at night and suffer the alcoholism and other problems that lawyers are prone to. Do well.
Good advice.
Take care of yourself.